Hey, what's up? This is Scott with Level Up Tutorials and welcome to Weekly Svelte. Now, in a couple of weekly Sveltes ago, we made this neat loading animation that basically just used the navigating state coming from the navigating app store. This allowed us to have a loading animation whenever we wanted it to, but also allowed us to have one on page navigation automatically. Now, the downsides of this thing were a few things. One, when we navigate to a page and that page loads relatively fast, you can kind of see a blip of the animation. It will come on, it will blip. You can blip it. It looks glitchy, doesn't look good. Another one is we wanted to have more control, maybe potentially set some text and maybe have some information, like 1 moment please type of deal, but have it be customizable. Now, the biggest of these things is obviously going to be the timeout. The timeout, I think, is probably the most important thing that we would like to have in this. So let's talk about how you might turn this automatic loader into something maybe a little bit more interesting, or maybe even just a little bit fancier. Because right now, all we had with this loading state was a very basic loading writable, right? This is just a true false. Now, this thing doesn't have to get that much more complicated, but this is going to be an approach to say, what if we wanted to make this more full-featured and more powerful, but at the same time keep some of its simplicity? That's what we're going to do in this video. So what we're going to do first and foremost is create a custom store for our loader. The reason why we're creating a custom store is because it's going to give us more control over the logic that happens inside of the store. That way we have to do less inside of our templates. So let's go ahead and say const new loading. Now, new loading is kind of a dumb name, but we'll just say new loading. Okay, whatever. New loading, or just loading, whatever you want to call this thing, is a function. Now, when you create a custom store in Svelte, we're basically creating a function that will then have the writable store inside of it. Like this, we're going to say const, where we can then pull out the subscribe, the update, and the set from a new writable. Now, this writable, unlike the last one, is going to contain more information than just a Boolean. Now, the last one was just true or false. This one's going to be an object that has a status, and its status is going to be initially set to idle, okay? And I'm going to have some possible statuses be idle, loading, or navigating. And I'm doing this instead of using like a is loading type of Boolean, right? Status will give us a little bit more control over there, especially when we want to be able to have a timeout for this thing. And we'll also have a message, which is going to be just an empty string. Okay, by default, no message. We don't need one. Now, what we're going to do from this thing is return the subscribe, the update, and the set. Even if we're not going to be using the subscribe, update, and set, we still want to return them all. Well, we don't need to, but I want to return them all just in case. Again, it's not that important to return them all. The subscribe is probably going to be the only one that we're going to use out of here before we create our custom functions. Now, instead of export const loading writable false down here, we're going to say export const loading is equal to, and then we can say new loading, which is a function, okay? So like this. We now have our custom store, okay? Now, this custom store is not quite going to be working correctly just yet, because if you were to give this a try for any particular reason, set loading, stop loading, right? We're still setting this thing to be a Boolean, but it's overwriting this object that's in here, okay? What we want to do is to get into a place where this works within this object that we have. So what do we do? Well, the first thing that we might want to do is head into our loading.svelte component. And this loading.svelte component, again, since we can subscribe to this data, in the past what we've said is if loading, then show the div. However, since this thing is going to be an object, we don't want to say if loading, we want to say if loading.status is equal to, if loading.status is equal to loading, then show the loader. That way, if it's set to navigating or idle, it's not going to show. Another thing we might want to do just for debugging purposes is just to output loading.status. You can see loading.status right now is set to undefined. If I refresh this page, still set to undefined. Don't worry about that. Okay, so loading is coming in from libLoading, loading status, and then if loading status is equal to loading, show the div. Okay, so a nice start here. We have our loading variable, again, export const loading. Now, the reason why this is undefined right now is because what's happening is initially this is loading up and this is setting this thing this way. So if we wanted to work within our previous setup where we had a reactive statement, and that reactive statement was just saying, hey, while this is navigating, then let's go ahead and load this, we can tweak this ever so slightly. And we can tweak this to work within a custom function. So we haven't talked a lot about custom stores in this video besides just creating one, but the cool thing about custom stores is that you can have functions that do functionality for you, right? And the line that we're going to replace this with will end up being like very simple, okay? So before we do that, let's go ahead and create a custom function. And this function is going to exist inside of our loading state. And I should say, by the way, I will make this this CodePen, this stack blitz, not a CodePen. I will make this available in the show notes in both the starting and the end state, just in case you want to see, want to follow along as well. Okay, so we have this. Let's go ahead and say we have a function which is going to be named set navigate, and set navigate is going to have an is navigating, and this is going to be a Boolean. Okay, set navigate like this. And set navigate is going to have the update function. The update function comes directly from our writable and will update the store. Now this has a callback and can utilize the previous state, but we don't need the previous state in here. We just need to set this thing. So we will return some new state in here, and the status will either be navigating or idle, right? We have idle, loading, or navigating. And navigating isn't going to trigger the loading state. It's going to kind of trigger this preloading state. So we're going to say is navigating. And if is navigating is true, we'll set this to navigating. Otherwise, we'll set this to be idle. Okay? And if you wanted to, you could set the message to be empty as well, because I typically wouldn't have a message on my navigating status here. So if you just want to clear that out, that's fine too. This is a nice little easy, quick little function, and we can now return this function from our custom store like this. So if we return this set navigate as a function here, what we can do is head into our layout.svelte, where we can then have our reactive statement. And if it feels like you don't know where I'm going with some of this, don't worry, we're gonna recap at the end once this is all done. So that way we can have a very clear picture of what's happening. So you remember in the last video, we checked to see essentially if this state wasn't null. We just did this double reverse here, and this gave us either a true or false if we were navigating. What we want to do now is we want to say loading, and keep in mind, there's no $sign before here because we're not subscribing to the store. We're calling a method from the store. We're going to say loading dot set navigating. I think that's what I called it. Set navigating. Set navigate. Okay, set navigate, not set navigating. Set navigate is now going to be equal to the same exclamation $navigating store. So what we're doing this time is essentially the same thing we were doing before, but instead of setting a Boolean value inside of a store, we're calling a function set navigate. And this is either going to call this function with a true or a false. If we're navigating, it's going to call this with a true. If we're not navigating, it's going to call it with a false. Something that you're going to be seeing instantly is that we see idle right here now in our actual HTML. So when we click about here, you can see it says navigating. It says navigating still, right? And I was actually just now, I was seeing a hang up where this was not going back to idle, but if you're on that, it could just be Stack Blitz being weird. So I'll give this thing a refresh and you can see it says idle. I click about, it says navigating, and then after it navigates, it will then say idle once again. And you can see it now says idle, okay? So we have a little bit more control over this thing now. Let's go ahead and let's add in some timeout business into this, because what we want is that if the navigating state lasts for more than a couple of seconds, we want this to say loading and then trigger our loading status is equal to loading. Now, there's a really easy way that we can do that inside of loading.svelte with a reactive if statement. We can say $: if $loading.status is equal to navigating, okay? If it's equal to navigating, what we want is to run a timeout. We want to say, hey, start a timeout, set timeout. And this is going to have a function that runs after a small amount of time. The amount of time is determined by the second parameter of the timeout. We can say 400 milliseconds here. Now, inside of this timeout, we're going to wait 400 milliseconds and then check a second time to say if while we're looking at this, if loading.status is still equal to navigating, then what we can do is we can set loading.status to equal. Notice how there's one equal sign here, not 3 or 2. Loading.status is going to be equal to then loading, okay? So check this out. Now, if I refresh this page, you'll be able to see that when I click about in 1 second here, it's going to wait, and then 400 milliseconds later, the animation should kick on. There we go. You can see the status is now loading. It has then navigated, the loading goes away, and it's back to idle. If I go to home, you can see it never hits that loading status because it's waiting 400 milliseconds. It never hits that 400 milliseconds, therefore it never goes into the loading state. Very cool, right? Perfect. Now, what are some of the last ways that we could improve this thing? Because I did say I wanted to add a couple of things. One which would be the loading message here. Now, the loading message, this I don't know if I even set this HTML up to work properly with the loading message, but if you wanted some kind of a loading message, you would just have the paragraph tag in here. And I don't know why that auto-completed to applet. I don't know what Stack Blitz was thinking there. We would say loading.message, and you would say if loading.message, just show it. And then you'd want to do some fancy HTML, CSS stuff to make this actually look decent. But we'll just say pound if loading.message, as in if this is not an empty string, then show it. And this is how you would have a loading message. Again, since we don't have a loading message on our page navigation, nothing's going to show for right now. But let's go ahead and have a loading message for these start and stop loading buttons, which you can see no longer work. So the start and stop loading buttons, we can fix those and add a loading message. Let's head to our index page or our layout. That's where they are, our layout. So what we were doing before was we were saying loading is equal to true, loading is equal to false, that kind of thing. Yeah, you know what? You could do this a number of ways. If you wanted to keep this in sort of the custom store realm, we could make this another function here, where this function could just be simply function set loading. And set loading could take a Boolean, so is loading, and that would be a Boolean, and then we could have a message, which will be a question mark colon string, which is an optional prop, where we'll say, hey, this thing is optional. You know, you can have it if you want. If not, that's cool too. No worries, whatever. It's all good. So is loading Boolean message is equal to string. And then from here, what you could do is you could just simply say we have an update. Update is going to return. Let's scroll down here. It's going to return the status is going to be either is loading. Once again, we're going to do a ternary, and we're going to say if it is setting to loading, we'll set this to loading immediately instead of navigating loading. Otherwise, we'll set this to idle. So if we want to set this to be false, so we'll just immediately set it to idle. And then likewise, message will be set to is loading. If this is a true, if we're triggering the loading state on, we'll want to set the message to the message we're passing in here. And otherwise, it will be an empty string. That way, when you stop loading at any given point, it clears the message. That way we don't get any old messages in here. If you want to have another way to do this optional prop where we're saying it's a string, you might want to actually say it's an empty string as a default value too. We could just do it like this, okay? Easy peasy, just like this. And then likewise, make sure you return your set loading out of your custom store, okay? So this is the set loading function. Again, this custom store is still only 30 lines of code. This thing's really pretty simple. So we have our set loading function, which now what we can do with our set loading function is instead of doing $ loading is equal to true, we can say loading dot set loading is equal to true, and then we could have a message in here like I'm, actually this is a, I don't know, let's do a double quotes here so I can have an I'm loading, okay? And let's get rid of this is equal to true. Sorry, this trying to deal with large fonts in a small environment here, okay? So when we click the loading button now, it's going to run a function that says loading.setLoading, and it's going to say true with the text of I'm loading. When we click the stop loading button, it's going to call loading.setLoading, and this is going to pass in false, just like this. Okay, so this is all pretty simple, right? This page itself has hardly changed when you think about it. We're just changing, we're calling functions instead of setting properties. And then this thing has gotten a little bit bigger, but not really that ballooned. And this thing's ever gotten ever so slightly bigger, but really not ballooned at all. So this thing is really endlessly pretty simple. Again, we get that neat page loading animation working on now when we navigate. But we also get the ability to say set loading. You can see I'm loading. Here is our custom text. It's loading, it's loading, it's loading, stop loading. I'm loading, stop loading, load after a delay. So this is a complex loading system that works in both the ability to have custom events to trigger your loading states, right? We could call this from anywhere. What are you doing? You're hitting a mutation in your API, call this set loading is equal to true with a message, right? Or you just want this same loading animation to work automatically on your navigating. Well, you have that automatically with this loading set navigate exclamation navigating. So this is a complex loader, but at the same time, it's still an exceedingly simple automatic loader for SvelteKit. So if you like this video, please subscribe at leveluptutorials.com. We have a ton of Svelte content. We have a ton of HTML and JavaScript and CSS content too, as well as React content and Vue content and Figma, all sorts of stuff. So if you like working on the web, head on over to leveluptutorials.com and sign up to become a pro today and get access to all of our content. Thanks so much for watching. And if you want to see how this thing really, can function and work, go ahead and fork this repo, tweak it, make changes to it. I want to see what you do with this thing. It's so very cool. So thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next.